Greetings. This week we're going to talk about steps 6 and 7, which is developing the evaluation component and then also thinking about some sustainability practices. So let's first start with step 6, which is creating the evaluation component of your grant proposal. There's some questions that you tend to want to ask yourself when you first start thinking about developing an evaluation component. The first one is, was the program successful? And then did it do what it was designed to do? What impact did the program have on the community or target population? What did you learn from this experience that can be leveraged? We'll talk about what leverage is in a little bit. What didn't work and why or why not didn't it work? And then what's different in the community or the lives of those targeted as a result of the program? So these are questions that typically you try to answer in an evaluation. Now, there's some common terms that are thrown around in the evaluation component of a grant proposal. Most importantly is the term impact, and that's the intended or unintended long-term change that occurred as a result of what you did. And so we're always trying to gauge how we can, and we always are trying to tell our funders how we are going to try to gauge the impact of the intervention or whatever it was that the grant funded. Another term that's used commonly is called leverage. And that's where you're using funds to attract funds from other sources. And so leverage is not something I'm going to ask you to do in your evaluation component, but just understand that sometimes it's very important to explain how you're going to use some funds within the grant to try to attract funding from other sources. And another common term used in the evaluation component is ROI, or return on investment. And that's the benefit based on the amount of funds used to produce it. And of course, it makes sense that funders are looking for the highest return on their investment. So for instance, we know that the apprenticeship model that the federal government supports has a return on investment of $1 or $120 for every dollar that they spend on supporting apprenticeships in the United States. Very high return on investment. It's always nice, convenient, or even maybe required that you're able to calculate the return on the investment. So why do we include an evaluation component? Well, of course, the first, I think, biggest thing is it helps us answer the so what, who cares, which is always important for us to try to answer in the grant proposal. And then secondly, there's 6 major things that can come out of an evaluation component. And of course, the first one is find out whether or not the hypothesis was correct. Did the organization or did you originally propose actually do what the organization expected that it would do? And the second one is determine whether the methods that were specified were indeed used and were the objectives met. Determine whether an impact was made. Maybe it's to obtain feedback from clients to see if they liked the particular intervention or program that you developed. It also helps to maintain some control over the project, so funders are able to have a little bit more control over the project by always looking towards your evaluation component that you proposed and seeing if things are actually turning out the way you wanted them to turn out. And then, depending on how you develop your evaluation, it could help do some mid-course corrections. So when you're drafting your evaluation, of course, you want to think about what is the specific purpose of the evaluation, and then how will those findings be used? What will the organization know after the evaluation that it does not know now? What will the organization do after the evaluation that cannot do now because of lack of information? How will the lives of the people or community served by the organization or by your grant be better? Did the organization or you use the funder's investment wisely? Were the funds effectively managed or potentially leveraged? And then was the budget accurate? So there's 2 different major ways in which we collect data in general, but especially in the evaluation component. It's quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative has to do with numbers, and so it's methods to count or measure data. And so it's statistically analyzed information. And so if your grant has to do something with understanding the quantities or frequency of a particular aspect of a program, such as the number of enrollees or the numbers of dropouts, if maybe somewhere in your grant you're determining whether cause and effect relationship was present, so you're looking for correlations, maybe you're comparing two different methods and seeking to achieve the same outcomes and see which one was better. Maybe you're establishing numerical baselines. So you would maybe have some means, or you would have that were derived from post-tests or pre-tests or some type of follow-up. So if what you're doing has to do with numbers, then you're going to probably take a more quantitative approach to your evaluation. Now, if it happens to be that you're dealing more with people directly, then you may have more of a qualitative bend to your evaluation component. And so maybe you're trying to figure out feelings or opinions about a program that you had within the grant. Maybe you're trying to gain some insight into how patterns of relationships kind of unfolded within the program. Or maybe you're looking for multiple perspectives to understand the big or whole picture. Or maybe you're trying to identify approximate indicators that clients are moving in the right direction. So while quantitative has to do solely with numbers, qualitative is more of the observation or the experience. And so when you're thinking about developing your evaluation component, I want you to keep in mind, are you going to have a more quantitative or qualitative evaluation, or are you going to use what's called mixed methods, in which maybe you have some qualitative, but you also have some quantitative? Now, step 7 talks about developing sustainability strategies, and while I won't have an assignment over this, I will ask a discussion question. So the purpose of the sustainability component of a grant would be to help grant seekers consider how to sustain funding beyond the grant cycle. So imagine you're asking for money for something, and typically, at least in many instances, they're going to want to see that you have some form of sustainability. Now, the one thing I noticed with at least this semester's grant proposals is that yours aren't really asking much for sustainability. So if you happen to have a proposal that's asking for sustainability component to it, then obviously you're going to want to fill it out. But some of your grants are just kind of one-time grants where really they aren't concerned about what's going to happen after the grant cycle is over. So that leads to the question of, when should you add a sustainability component? Well, if your grant is seeking program capital or capacity building funding, then you need to mention something about how you're going to sustain this after the grant. So imagine if you have something where you get 20 computers for a classroom, and so the grant helps fund for those 20 computers. You would want to mention somewhere in your proposal, because someone who purchased, or an organization or foundation that purchased these 20 computers are going to want to know how they're going to be taken care of after the year grant ends. You'd want to mention something about that. That is a sustainability component. If, for instance, maybe it's some capacity building in the sense that you're having an extra room added on to your organization, they're going to want to know about the maintenance of that room. So here on campus, they are constantly building new buildings, and that funding comes from a variety of sources. But one of the big things that they have to determine is how are they going to sustain that building after it's been built. The initial funds will build it, then other funds have to come into place later to keep it operational. So what are some options that you have when it comes to sustainability funding? Well, there's always more grants. So you could talk about having continuous grants. Also, maybe this particular activity that was originally funded, the development of it was funded through your original grant. Maybe now there's a fee to it. Or maybe the development of whatever this was allows you to now sell that service or sell that item to help support the effort that was originally funded. And so you would want to think about these things when you're drafting up your grant proposal if it makes sense. So that's the end of this particular step, or this particular week's step chapters. So I want you to go on to eLearning and see what your assignment is. Good luck.